What's going on? It's supposed to be the summer solstice, first day of summer. And lately y'all have been seeing me in this blanket. So I'm freezing. All right. So today we're going to be talking about, this is a personal story about how I was raging in 2020. I'm just going to wait for a few folks to pop in. But there's going to be some lessons at the end of this story, or even during the story, that I think might be helpful. What I'm about to talk about is going to be a bit unconventional. Some people might not like might not agree with what I'm about to share, but it's okay. It's my process. Hey there, Bunny. What's happening? Thanks for joining. But yeah, 2020, as we know, was a year for everybody. And it was during that time where a lot of things came up for me. And one of the things that came up for me was rage. And it was something that I had to look at pretty deeply and in a very humbling way. And so during 2020, in the height of like the BLM movement, protests, racism, all of that intense societal turmoil, chaos, I decided to step up. At that time, I had already reactivated my license, so I started to offer pro bono therapy. And I also started to offer BIPOC support groups and spaces. And we had a big turning out for those spaces. And I just wanted it to be a space where people can talk about things that might be, harder to talk about in other spaces, where they can just be vulnerable. But I also wanted it to be a space where people could also learn some things, take some of that knowledge, go back and turn it into wisdom and start applying it to their lives. And then what I realized after, I don't even know how many sessions I did, because so many people signed up for free therapy, that it became a lot to manage. And then doing the BIPOC support spaces every week, I started to notice something that had me questioning if what I was creating made sense. Because what I was noticing with people is that people weren't necessarily coming to these support spaces and these groups to do anything differently. And what I mean by that is, it became a place where people were just sort of airing out their grievances. And so everybody, it just became like a collective trauma bond. This thing just fell off. It became a collective trauma bond. So every week we were literally trauma bonding about racism, about hating the white man. And I started to think, was this constructive? Hey, Hime. And I realized it wasn't as constructive as I thought. And it started to feel weird to me. And so with the height of the racism and all the stuff that was going on in 2020, I remember getting really swept up, like a lot of people. Swept up with, and all of the stuff that was happening with the protests. And I remember having a conversation with my partner, and we both come from very different experiences and upbringings. I have very different experiences sort of with being an immigrant in the United States, and always being the only Black person, and having really traumatic encounters, racial issues with the community that I grew up in. And so I had a specific worldview, whereas my partner didn't have those experiences. And so she always led with love and couldn't understand or relate to how I used to feel about this topic. And it was a point of contention. But then I realized after seeing the support group where there was no traction and no forward movement, and people were sort of just stuck in their stories and stuck in their narratives, I felt like I was doing a disservice. And so it was around the time where I met my mentor, my spiritual mentor, and I had a lot of questions about Black, white, all of those things. And I wanted to see how sort of racism played into sort of the spiritual lens. And I also wanted to work on my rage because I felt very much caught in my own personal rage. And I was like, why am I so angry about this stuff, right? What is it about this that's really just sort of getting me, getting riled up? Because I didn't like the way it made me feel, when you think about being in a constant state of anger, you think about how that affects your body. I mean, anger is definitely related to like the lungs, how that impacts the circulation and airflow in your body on an energetic level. And those kinds of intense low vibratory feelings can really cause a lot of dis-ease in your body. And I started to feel that, and I didn't like it. And so I started to question why I was so angry and where did it come from, and why all of this was created the way it did, and why I was at all these. It was like an existential crisis that I was experiencing at the time. And as I was going through my own personal healing journey and my own personal process, I realized I didn't want to rage anymore. I realized I didn't want to be angry anymore, because I started to see like if love is truly the answer and the goal, where does rage and anger fit in? And now I believe that anger is useful, because anger obviously shows us our passion, it shows us our values, it shows us our frustration, it shows us what we need and whether our needs are being met. So those emotions are very much valid, but they can get skewed, and it could send us into a very narrow mindset. And I found myself falling into that trap. I found myself forcing, or at least having forceful conversations with people to be a certain way of sort of what I expected them to be. And that just didn't sit well with me after a while. And so I took a step back. I actually stopped doing the group because I needed some time to reflect, and stopped doing the free therapy. And I started to dig a little bit deep as to what was going on. And I realized that a lot of things in the world is placed to sort of distract us to a certain degree. And when I started to look at like the activists, I started to see how sometimes being an activist, you can sometimes use that as a way to cover up your own pain. So I started to see the society as a place where a lot of people were misdirecting their own anger and their own rage, and also using a lot of these platforms to work through some of their trauma. And obviously I can't confirm a lot of this stuff, but it just, when you're that angry at something, it's so necessary to sort of pause and look within to see kind of like what's going on. And so I decided that, this is just another distraction. Because if you have a bunch of people who are in opposite sides of the fence, who are filled with rage and anger, they can't be united. And so we sort of have them where we want them to be. And if you have a bunch of people who are raging separate, then we can distract them from actually being connected with themselves, right? We can distract them from getting to the root of their own healing. And so I realized a lot of the things that were occurring on the outside, again, were merely distractions. And one of the things my mentor was saying, be careful of how the movement moves you. Where is this place where is that feeling coming from? Because I found it hard to see how you can have love and compassion, and then hate on people to the point that you want to see harm done with them. So I had a really hard time wrapping my head around those two scenarios. And then I had a really hard time with the word justice, and being a former social worker, social justice was part of my identity, in which I happily began to let go. And so I was always somebody that was like, oh, that's not fair. Justice needed to be served. And I realized that that was actually leading me down towards a path of being separate. And what I mean by that is that from just on my own personal journey, I'm realizing, my personal spiritual journey, I'm realizing that what does it mean to have justice, right? And what does it mean to have a sense of morality? Can people also have the same sense of morality? Or is morality skewed in a way, right? Is there a spectrum to this? Is morality subjective? And how can a group of society come together and say that this is wrong and this is right? And who is the keeper of what is right and what is wrong? And so some of those questions was running through my mind. And who am I to say what is right and wrong for somebody else? I know what's right. I don't even like that kind of language anyway. I know what's right and what feels alignment for me and what feels out of alignment. I know that for myself. But for me to impose that on other people has a different agenda. And it seems incongruent to me. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so because I was so, when you're raging and angry, it's really hard to see anything with compassion and empathy. I would be really talking to folks and they would be seething with hate, but then want justice. And I couldn't understand that. And then I started to believe that who is the one that can serve justice? And what does justice actually mean? And so all of those questions had me really thinking deeply about my own personal rage. And so I started moving away from conversations about race, anything that would continue to have that conversation to divide, because I started to believe through my own healing journey and just plant medicines that we are all connected to a certain degree. And I also started to understand reincarnation a little bit more. And I feel like everybody is here to learn a specific lesson. And so if race is such a marker, right, for you in this time frame, I started to think well, what if in another lifetime you were somebody from a different culture? Maybe in this lifetime, you're supposed to learn what it feels like to be in this culture. And you're supposed to learn that with empathy and compassion. And when we don't tap into empathy and compassion, that creates more division. And when we fall into these sort of narratives that really weren't our narratives to begin with, we were sort of groomed into a lot of these narratives, then you begin to wonder if there's something else at play, right? You begin to wonder, what are they sort of distracting us from? What are they keeping us away from? And that's a connection, right? Because a group of folks who are united usually cannot be divided. But if you continue to hijack people's emotions, and if you continue to show them images that sort of kind of rev up the nervous system, get them fired up so that they can remain angry and remain in a constant state of rage, what does that do to somebody's physical, emotional, and spiritual health? It deteriorates it, right? And so I made it a mission for me to sort of work through a lot of that rage and to sort of walk through more forgiveness and to sort of release myself from that kind of energy. And I started to see that I started to reject the oppressive narrative. And I started to see that people really have the capacity and the ability to work themselves out of those narratives and create a healthier sense of self. But it takes a lot of just looking within to first really pick out whose narrative is in my head, why it's in my head, why it's been planted there, and how can I reach a more balance. Somebody said, I think the media and propaganda can turn your compassion into yeah, I mean, it's all, we already know, like propaganda and media, we already know what their purpose is here to do. And I remember not too long ago, we did a plant medicine live, talking about plants and all other things, fear. And somebody had asked me, can you speak to the accessibility to these plants in the BIPOC community? And I started to question, what does accessibility mean? Like, I feel like we've been sort of groomed to think about accessibility in a specific way. I'm not saying there aren't systems that are meant to do certain things. If you engage in the medical system, you may engage in a certain particular experience. If you engage in the school system, you may engage in a particular experience. And we already know something in the milk ain't clean. Like, a lot of things don't add up there. But plant medicines are indigenous plants that have been around for years, thousands of years. It's not that they're not accessible. I think what it is like people's narratives and attitudes towards a particular subject. So if I've been told that I'm not able to access certain things because of XYZ, then I'm just going to assume that these things are not accessible to me. Are you on a plane, Lily? What's up? I'm so rambling. I'm just going to believe that these things aren't accessible to me. And I feel like with certain groups of folks, we've sort of, we have a really hard time talking about stigmatized topics like mental health. Like, mental health is still like a stigma thing. I actually had a soul session with somebody today who, despite the mental health difficulties that she was experiencing, she still felt a lot of shame just to have a conversation of feeling like burnt out. Like, we're still having a hard time having those kinds of conversations. So if you're not even able to recognize that this is something that needs your attention, of course you're not going to see that this sort of plant medicines, this elixir, as everyone calls it, is accessible to you. And most of the time, it's like, okay, how are we creating the conditions to create accessibility, right? Because we create our conditions. And so it goes a little bit deeper than that. It's not that these things aren't accessible. It's our perspective on trusting the idea that, like, this piece of your mental health could actually be served in a different way. Because I think a lot of BIPOC people, there's a lot of distrust in the medical community. Most people don't even go and get themselves checked. So there's a lot that really plays into it. So it's not just like accessibility. And truth be told, like, some of these stuff you can access for low cost. It just depends on how you want to access them, right? And truth be told, like, how do I prepare myself to get access to some of these things? I remember when I first did I did this retreat in 2016. I didn't have the money for that retreat, but I was at a point where I was in such a dark place that I needed something to sort of snap me out of whatever situation I was going through on an emotional and spiritual level, that I called the coach, the coach's assistant. I had a conversation. I put it on a credit card. It was like a week. It was like a 7-day thing. Credit card. Flew across the country to the West Coast. Spent over $2,000 and did this thing. So I don't know if it's accessibility, but is there a willingness to strategize? I think often we get really caught up in problems versus the solutions. It's like, how do I make this thing work? What can I do to make something work that I deeply desire to experience? So I say all this to say that sometimes, depending on what you're consuming, depending on what you're watching, be very mindful how it's hijacking your emotions. Be very mindful how it's moving you. Because I don't care how many, and I did a post about this, I don't care how many DEIs or any other initiatives or laws passed. That doesn't cure hate. It doesn't cure hate. Love cures hate. And I'm not saying that like I'm of God consciousness and I've got it all figured out. I'm still human. I still struggle with certain things. And truth be told, things still get on my nerves. But I'm starting to see the souls of people. I'm starting to see people as human beings going through their own personal challenges, their own individual challenges that usually has nothing to do with me. And when you start to separate yourself from the rhetoric, from the narrative, you just start to see people for who they are, for how they show up, and you start to have a bit more compassion and a bit more empathy. And when you start to have a bit more compassion, a bit more empathy, the conflict, right? The conflict sort of subsides, right? Because now you can just focus on yourself. Because can you imagine a world filled with people who are just focusing on their own healing? What kind of world would that be, right? Where folks are just not focusing on other people, what they're doing, what they're not doing, how they should say this, how, in which ways. Like I feel like it's getting out of hand with how people can actually have a conversation with each other. I feel like everything is being so either stifled, censored. People are telling you how to say certain things when they don't even identify as the same as you. So I feel like one of the things that my mentor says, like what we're really dealing with is an identity crisis, right? And so we have a lot of people who are still trying to figure out who they are. And with that identity crisis, if you're not solid in your own foundation and footing, you're going to be swayed with anything that comes up. Anything is going to sweep you away, right? Kind of like the ocean waves. It's just going to get swept up. And then you're going to get lost, and you're not going to know who you are. So I feel like everybody's just sort of just trying to figure this whole thing out. And so I'm starting to have more empathy because I know that everybody has it figured out, and everybody's doing the best that they can with the conscious level that they're currently in, right? Because when you think about rage and anger on the consciousness scale, that's very low, right? And it has its time and its place. And so sometimes you might be here, and then you go back here, you go back here. But as much as you can, you want to keep your mental, emotional being at sort of like here, right? Whatever here is for you, but like that it feels good in your body. Because if you don't, you're really going to get pulled into a lot of the distractions that are out there. Everything is a distraction. Every narrative is a distraction. Every ideology is a distraction. Even some of the spiritual conference. Sometimes I have to, and I said this yesterday. I might have said it yesterday. I don't know which live. Everything's getting mixed up. Sometimes I have to pull away from even the spiritual community because I'm like, everybody got something to say. Everybody has something to say about something, and I don't even know if they know what they're saying. So just be mindful about this stuff. And I remember in 2020, it became like black only this and black that. And so a lot of businesses transitioned to black only this. And I mean, I had the opportunity to sort of, I'm just going to create a BIPOC only this and black this. And that just didn't feel right for me. It was out of integrity for me because, it just didn't feel right in my body. So I just kind of like faded to the background, faded to black, and just started to observe to see where everybody trickled. Because you have to understand, black and brown trauma is very profitable, even for black and brown people, right? Even for black and brown people. So it just became something that became profitable. You got to understand, your trauma is profitable for a lot of people. And so you got to be very mindful about that and how those things, I don't like the word trigger, but how those things sort of, I guess I'll use it, how those things trigger you. Let me see, there was another thing in the chat. Yes, the media can radicalize your compassion. It happened to me. It's not pointing to love. It's a distraction, in my opinion. 100%. So true. If you don't know your core, anything can trigger, sway, or rattle you. Yup. Yeah, my granny, but it's freezing. I'm so cold. First day of summer. But I had to look at my rage, and I just refused to be used as a prop. I refuse to be used as a prop. I refuse to be used to fuel other people's wars, whether that's emotional, political, spiritual, any of that stuff. I'm just not interested. I remember somebody had invited me to do a live, and, they're very like, they seem like cool people. I said yes to the live on the condition that we weren't going to focus on just specifically one group of people, right? I feel like healing, everybody deserves healing if they are willing and courageous to seek it. So, sure, do we have spaces that we feel a bit more comfortable in? Sure. But I don't see how you can have inclusion with exclusion. I don't get that. So I just be going rogue. I just be going rogue, doing my own thing and seeing how it lands and seeing first how it feels within myself. So whatever it is, while you're on this healing path, resist the urge to be moved by other people's agendas, and remember to just focus on your own healing process. We can't skip any steps. We can't get people to say certain things or be certain ways without them tapping into their own hearts, tapping into their own kindness, their own love, without them going on their own healing journey. Like, it's just, you can't, because then it's not authentic. You're just telling them what to say. You're telling them what to do, but they're not connected. They're not connecting to that. So it just doesn't seem authentic to me. Do I encourage people to create Black-owned businesses, and are they successful in your opinion? I don't really have an opinion about that. I feel like people need to do what feels right for them, what is within integrity for them, or what is in alignment for them, right? Again, people are in different levels of consciousness. And so what they see that they're doing, it may seem like totally right for them. Sometimes we look at people. I'll use Trump for an example. It's not a good example, so bear with me. Make America great again. Trump loves his country. Do we agree with how he loves his country? Maybe not. Do we agree with a lot of the things that he does? Maybe not. But from his perspective, he loves his country. And he'll do what he can for his country, right? So if you have a love for whatever it is, and if you feel like you are in alignment with that love, express it however you want to express it. My job is not to judge, or I'm just minding my business. Essentially, I'm over here minding my business and doing me, right? And hopefully I find other people who are sort of like-minded and know that love is always going to be the answer for all of this. Love, if everybody loved themselves, there would not be any like bullying or any of the stuff that you see out here. Because you see adults be bullying each other all the time. I'm getting off a tangent, but you just have a lot of hurt people hurting people. And that's what's going on. And then we call it politics, or we put a law in place, or we put some initiatives together. We put some rules that follow, some creeds, or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, if you don't love yourself, how can you love your fellow human, right? And that comes first. It sounds a little hippie, but I'm telling you, it's really that simplistic. It really is that simplistic. And humans don't necessarily like simplicity. We like to complicate things and make things really dramatic and emotional. And I get it, you know, I have a lot of compassion for it, but it's really that simple. But, you know, and the reason why, and I'll say this one last thing and I'm out of here, but the reason why, like some of the stuff that we're dealing with, this is nothing new, right? This is nothing new, okay? It's like a playbook, right? And so you begin to question, why are we still dealing with the same things that we dealt with 20 years ago, maybe in different form, maybe different characters, right? And I think a lot of that is because humans haven't learned. I do believe in reincarnation, and I believe karma is about completion, and when things are not completed, they will recycle themselves. So everybody's sort of, in my humble opinion, stuck in a karmic loop. Hopefully, and the more that you just focus on your own healing, you can really break a lot of these generational patterns so that you can literally liberate yourself. And that's the goal, love and liberation. Okay, that is all I've got. Hopefully you got little gems after that. And thank you for watching and participating. I really appreciate it. And I'll see y'all mañana. Take care.